Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Glenn Moots, and I'm professor of philosophy and political science here on our Michigan campus, and I serve as director of the Forum for Citizenship and Enterprise. The Forum was founded in 2009 here in Michigan to support our Northwood idea and promote the kind of discussion and habits necessary for good citizenship and honorable enterprise. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our debate of the resolution, America Should Adopt the Gold Standard. Our debate is generously sponsored by the Atlas Economic Research Foundation as part of their Sound Money initiative. And those of you that got here early got a copy of something that they've produced with FreedomWorks called A Guide to Sound Money. You can also find this online if all the copies are taken. And Atlas has been a generous partner of the Forum, and we're very thankful for their assistance. We're also partnering with Students for a Free Economy, a program of the Mackinac Center for Public Policy here in Midland. And they are streaming our debate live via their website, so we'll also extend a special greetings to those of you joining us through the World Wide Web. I'd like to turn over our podium to our moderator, Professor John Grether. Professor Grether earned his undergraduate degree here at Northwood in economics and management, his Master of Arts in economics from Central Michigan University, and his Juris Doctor from Michigan State University College of Law. Professor Grether joined the faculty at Northwood in 1994 and has served in a variety of teaching and administrative roles, including chair of the economics department, academic dean of the Michigan campus undergraduate program, and he is currently associate professor at the DeVos Graduate School of Management here at Northwood. As a teaching economist, Professor Grether received Northwood's Senior Class Faculty Excellence Award in 2004, 2005, and 2006, Northwood University's Faculty Excellence Award in 2005, and the Sam Murata Faculty Ethics Award in 2006. And when John was teaching in our undergraduate program, he was a big favorite, and I suspect he is in the graduate program now. Professor Grether's research interests include Austrian economic theory, international trade, international law, new institutional law and economics, public choice theory, and experimental economics. He has been a commentator in both local and national media on a variety of economic and education issues and has been published and presented internationally on the subject of regulatory institutional failure. John will provide you with an overview of our subject and our format and introduce our participants. At the conclusion of our debate, Professor Grether will be moderating about 30 minutes of questions and answers. And I'm asking everyone who has a question to use one of those cards that was available at the back. There's a table with cards. And if you put your question on there, we'll collect those and get those to Professor Grether so that he can moderate the Q&A at the end. And so with that, please join me in welcoming our moderator for tonight's event, Professor John Grether.
Good evening. I'd like to thank Professor Moots for giving me the opportunity to moderate this evening, and all of you, ladies and gentlemen, for your attendance. I think this is going to be an interesting evening for all of us. In the wake of the global financial crisis in 2008, the ability of developed nations to meet their obligations into the future looks grim. According to a 2010 report by the Bank of International Settlements, the unfunded cost of developed world social welfare programs, unfunded, is estimated to be $95 trillion over the next 30 years. The same study estimates the total sovereign debt capacity for the developed world over those same 30 years to be something around $35 trillion. So the difference between $95 trillion worth of obligations and $35 trillion worth of borrowing capacity is a problem that we will be facing. The prescription from Bank of International Settlements is the reduction and possible elimination as soon as possible of many contingent spending programs that are offered by governments in the developed world. So reduce our Social Security system, reduce our funded medical benefits, reduce those obligations. What they don't say in that same very interesting paper is that the only alternative to that is for the developed world to monetize their debt. Now, if governments do that, there's a risk of inflation. Today, we see gold at record nominal prices. In real terms, we still aren't anywhere near where we were in the 1980s. But people are turning back to gold and silver as hedges against inflation, at least in their expectations. The reality of inflation has yet to appear. So we see the commodity markets, especially the gold and silver markets, responding to an expectation of increased inflation that may or may not exist, depending, at least from my perspective, on the political will of the developed world. So it's within this frame that I introduced tonight's debate topic that America should adopt the gold standard. Before I introduce our presenters, allow me to explain the format for this evening's debate. I will serve as the timekeeper. Our presenters will each have 15 minutes to present their constructive arguments in favor to or opposed to the topic. After that, our presenters will each be allowed 10 minutes for rebuttal, and the rebuttal portion will be followed with 5 minutes each for concluding arguments and responses. Upon conclusion of the formal debate, I will take written questions from the audience to pose them to each of our speakers. Each speaker will have the opportunity to respond to those questions. The question and answer period should last till approximately 8:30. I think that's the time we are scheduled to be done. And as Professor Moots pointed out, if you have questions along the way, we would like to have those questions to the front prior to the beginning of the question and answer period. Tonight, arguing the affirmative position is Dr. Richard Ebeling. Dr. Ebeling is professor of economics here at Northwood. He's recognized as one of the leading members of the Austrian School of Economics. Dr. Ebeling writes and lectures widely in the United States, Europe, Asia, and Latin America on monetary theory and policy, government regulation of business and the welfare state, the economics of growth, stability, and international trade, fiscal policy, taxation and government debt, and the political and economic principles of the free society. He's the author of Political Economy, Public Policy and Monetary Economics, Ludwig von Mises and the Austrian Tradition, and also Austrian Economics and the Political Economy of Freedom. He's the co-author of In Defense of Capitalism and the editor of Selected Writings of Ludwig von Mises in 3 volumes published by the Liberty Fund. He served as president for the Foundation for Economic Education from 2003 to 2008 and was the Ludwig von Mises Professor of Economics at Hillsdale College in Hillsdale, Michigan from 1988 to 2003 and served as vice president of the Future Freedom Foundation from 1990 to 2003. In 1990 and 91, Professor Ebeling traveled frequently to the former Soviet Union and worked with the government of Lithuania and members of the Russian parliament and the city of Moscow on free market reform and privatization of the socialist economy. In January 1991, he witnessed firsthand the Soviet military crackdown in Vilnius, Lithuania, where 13 people were killed. While in Moscow in August 1991, he joined the Defenders of Freedom and Democracy at the barricades surrounding the Russian parliament during the failed Soviet hardline communist coup attempt. He's the author of hundreds of articles. His writings have appeared in the Washington Times, the Boston Globe, Investors Business Daily, Detroit News, National Review, Online, Reason, The Freeman, Ideas on Liberty, the American Journal of Economics and Sociology, Political Studies, International Journal of World Peace, Advances in Austrian Economics, and numerous other publications. Dr. Ebeling appears frequently on radio talk shows around the United States, discussing government policy and the American economy. He is regularly interviewed by Radio Liberty on American and Russian political economic affairs, which are then translated and broadcast into Russia. He's appeared on Fox News, CNBC, and Fox Business News with Neil Cavuto. Richard Ebeling received his PhD in economics from Middlesex University in London, his MA in economics from Rutgers University, and a BA in economics from Cal State University, Sacramento. Won't you please help me welcome Dr. Richard Ebeling. Arguing the negative position tonight is Dr. Robert Barsky. Dr. Robert Barsky earned his BA from the University of Michigan in 1980, his PhD from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in 1986. He joined the University of Michigan faculty in 1985 and has been there ever since, except for a brief period spent at the University of Chicago Graduate School of Business. Dr. Barsky is a faculty associate of the Survey Research Center at the University of Michigan and a research associate at the National Bureau for Economic Research, working in the Monetary Economics Group. He has been a visiting scholar and or consultant for the Federal Reserve Board, the International Monetary Fund, and most recently, the Bank of Israel. He recently participated in a joint project involving the Japanese Cabinet Office and the Center for Research in the Japanese Economy at Columbia University to study the Japanese bubble and subsequent deflation and long-term stagnation of the Japanese economy. A volume from this project was published by the MIT Press late last year. He has written extensively on macroeconomics and finance, business cycles, monetary theory and history, and related areas. His work has been published in the American Economic Review, the Journal of Political Economy, the Quarterly Journal of Economics, and the Journal of Monetary Economics. His recent work has been on the macroeconomics of news shocks and animal spirit shocks with applications to consumer confidence and the fundamental origins of business cycles. Appropriate to this debate, Dr. Barsky has several published papers on the behavior of prices and interest rates in the United States and Britain during the gold standard era. His early paper, Gibson's Paradox and the Gold Standard, joint with Lawrence Summers, was the basis for a lawsuit against Summers during his tenure as Secretary of the Treasury, alleging a conspiracy to depress the price of gold. Very interesting. Would you please help me welcome Dr. Robert Barsky. And we will start right away with the affirmative, constructive affirmative, and that would be Dr. Ebeling.
Thank you.
So would you start?
The severity of the current economic crisis has been serving as a catalyst for reconsideration of some fundamental questions about economic policy. This has included the size and role of government in society, the national public debt and the sustainability of entitlement programs, and the relevancy of fiscal stimulus for economic recovery. It has also thrown into sharp relief some crucial flaws in the nature and workings of the prevailing monetary system. The central question, I will argue, is whether or not we should continue to leave monetary and banking policy in the discretionary hands of central banks and the monetary central planners who manage it. Make no mistake about it, central banking is monetary central planning. The United States, and indeed virtually the entire world, operate under a regime of monetary socialism. Historically, socialism has meant an economic system in which the government owns, manages, and plans the use of the means of production. Modern central banking is a system in which the government, either directly or through some appointed agency, such as the Federal Reserve in the United States, has monopoly ownership and control of the medium of exchange. Through this control, the government and its agency has predominant influence over the value or the purchasing power of the monetary unit and can significantly influence a variety of market relationships. These include the rates of interest at which borrowing and lending goes on in the banking and financial sectors of the economy, and therefore the patterns of savings and investment in the market. If there is one lesson to be learned from the history of the last 100 years, it is the fundamental disaster of placing control of the money supply in the hands of governments. It is worth recalling that money is not the origin, does not have its origin in the laws or the decrees of kings and princes. money is the most widely used medium of exchange and generally accepted device for undertaking transactions, is an outgrowth of the free choices and decisions of market participants themselves. Commodities such as gold and silver were selected over generations by market participants as the monies of choice, due to their useful characteristics to better facilitate the exchange of goods and services. But for almost all of recorded history, governments have attempted to gain control of the production and manipulation of money, to serve their seemingly insatiable appetite to extract more and more of the wealth produced by the ordinary members of society. Ancient rulers would clip and debase gold and silver coins of their subjects. More modern rulers have taken advantage of the monetary printing press to churn out out paper money to fund their expenditures and redistributive largesse in excess of the taxes they impose upon the citizenry. Today, the process has become even easier through the click of a mouse on a computer screen, which in the blink of an eye can create tens of billions of dollars out of thin air. Thus, monetary debasement and the price inflation that normally accompanies it has served as a method for imposing a hidden tax on the wealth of the citizenry. It is the corrosive, destructive, and distortive effects from monetary manipulation by governments that led virtually all of the leading economists of the 19th century to endorse the anchoring of the monetary system in a commodity such as gold, to prevent governments from using their powers over the creation of paper monies to cover their budgetary extravagance. Under a gold standard, it is gold that is the actual money. Paper currency and the various forms of checking and other deposit accounts that may be used in market transactions are money substitutes, representing a fixed quantity of the gold money on deposit with a banking or other financial institution that are then redeemable on demand. Any net increases in the quantity of currency and checking and related deposits are dependent upon increases in the quantity of gold that depositors with banking and financial institutions add to their individual accounts. And any withdrawal of gold from their accounts through redemption requires that the quantity of currency notes and checking and related accounts in circulation be reduced by the same amount. Under a gold standard, a central bank is relieved of all authority and power to arbitrarily manage the monetary order. Now, many critics of the gold standard consider this a rigid and inflexible rule about how the monetary system and the quantity of money in society is to be determined and constrained. Yet the advocates of the gold standard have long argued that this relative inflexibility is essential to discipline governments within the confines of a hard budget. Without the escape hatch of the monetary printing press, governments either must tax the citizenry or borrow part of the savings of the private sector to cover its expenditures. Those proposing government spending must either justify it by explaining where the tax dollars will come from and upon whom the taxes will fall, or make the case for borrowing a part of the savings of society to cover those expenditures, but at market rates of interest that tell the truth about what it will cost to attract lenders to lend the sum to the government rather than to private sector borrowers, and therefore at the social cost of private sector investment and future growth that will have to be foregone. In other words, it prevents the government from monetizing the debt to cover part or all of its budget deficits. The borrowed sums cannot be created out of thin air through the central banking monetary expansion process. The government under a gold standard can no longer create the illusion that something can be made from nothing. Now, it must be admitted that even some advocates of economic freedom and limited government have been advocates of paper money. The most notable one in the second half of the 20th century was Milton Friedman. Over most of his professional career, Friedman argued that maintaining a gold standard was a waste of society's resources. Why squander the men, material, and machinery digging gold out of the ground to simply store it away in the vaults of the banks? It is better to use these scarce resources to produce more of the ordinary goods and services that can enhance the standard and quality of people's lives. Control the potential arbitrary recklessness of central banks, Friedman proposed, by setting up a monetary rule that says, increase the money supply by some small annual percent, with no discretion left in the hands of the monetary managers. But it is less well known that in the years after Friedman won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1976, he had second thoughts about this monetary prescription. In a 1986 article on the resource costs of redeemable paper money, He argued that when looking over the monetary mismanagement and mischief caused by banks, governments, and central banks during the 20th century, it was, as he put it, crystal clear that the cost of mining, minting, and storing gold as the basis of a monetary system would have been far less than the disruptive and destabilizing costs imposed on society due to a paper money inflation system and the booms and busts of the business cycle. In his 1985 presidential address before the Western Economic Association on economists and public policy, he said that public choice theory had persuaded him that it would never be in the long-run self-interest of governments or central banks to manage the monetary system according to some hypothetical public interest. Those in government or holding the levers of the monetary printing press will always be susceptible to the temptations and pressures of short-run political gains that monetary expansion can fund. He admitted that it had been, as he put it, a waste of my time to try to get governments and central banks to follow his idea for a monetary rule. And in another article in 1986 on Has Government Any Role in Money, Friedman said that while he was not ready at that time to advocate a return to the gold standard, he did conclude that, quote, leaving the monetary and banking arrangements to the market would have produced a more satisfactory outcome than was actually achieved through government involvement. But it is not only the political dangers arising from government mismanagement of paper money that justifies the establishment of a gold standard. It is also, and equally, the fact that monetary central planning is unworkable as a means to maintain economy-wide stability, full employment, and growth. Especially since the 1930s, many economists and policymakers influenced by Keynes and the Keynesian Revolution have believed markets are potentially unstable and susceptible to wide and prolonged fluctuations in employment and output that can only be prevented or reduced through activist monetary and fiscal policy. But in reality, the causation runs in the opposite direction. It is central bank manipulations of money, credit, and interest rates that have generated the instability and periodic swings in economy-wide production and employment. The fact is, financial institutions and interest rates have important work to do in the market economy. Banks and other financial intermediaries are supposed to serve as the middlemen who bring together those who wish to save portions of their earned income with others who desire to borrow and invest that savings in profit-oriented productive ways that generate capital formation, technological improvements, and cost-efficient production of new, better, and more goods and services to satisfy consumer demands in the future. Market-determined interest rates are meant to bring those savings and investment plans into coordination with each other, so that the amount of invested capital and the time shape of the investment horizons that are undertaken are consistent with the available real savings to support them to maintainable completion. Monetary expansion by central banks creates the illusion that there is more actual investable savings in the economy than really exists. And the false interest rate signals generated in the banking system by a monetary expansion not only misinforms potential investment borrowers about the amount of real savings available for capital projects, but creates an incorrect basis for determining the present value calculations that influence the time horizons for the investments undertaken. It is these false monetary and interest rate signals that induces the misdirection of resources, the malinvestment of capital, and the incorrect allocation of labor among employments in the economy that sets the stage for an inevitable and inescapable correction and readjustment that represents the recession stage of the business cycle that follows the collapse of an artificial boom. The monetary planners can never be more successful in determining an optimal quantity of money or the right interest rates to assure savings and investment coordination than all other socialist planners ever were when they tried to plan agricultural production or industrial output in socialist economies. All such attempts at monetary planning and management by central planners are instances of what Friedrich Hayek called in his Nobel lecture a pretense of knowledge, that they can know more and better than the outcomes generated by competitive interactions of the market participants themselves. And as Adam Smith warned, nowhere is such regulatory power, quote, so dangerous as in the hands of a man who has the folly and presumption enough to fancy himself fit to exercise it. There is no way of knowing the optimal amount of money in the economy other than allowing the market participants in the competitive exchange process to decide what they want to use as money, which has historically been a commodity such as gold and silver. and there was no way of knowing what interest rate should be other than allowing the market forces of supply and demand for lending and borrowing to determine those interest rates through a process of private sector financial intermediation without government or central bank interference and manipulation. Finally, how do we return to a functioning and workable gold standard? Under the current government and central bank-controlled monetary system, the simplest method might be for the monetary authority to stop creating and printing money and credit. Over a short period of time, a fairly reasonable estimate could be made about the actual quantity of a nation's currency and checking and related deposits that are in existence and in circulation. A new legal redemption ratio would be established by dividing the estimated total quantity of all forms of these money substitutes in circulation, and divide that into the quantity of gold possessed by the government and the central bank. A country following this procedure would then once again be on a gold standard. Its long-run maintainability, of course, would require that the government and the central bank to follow those rules of the game, that no increase in the quantity of money substitutes should be created and brought into circulation unless there has been a net increase in the deposits of gold that people have deposited into their accounts with those banks and financial institutions. Can we trust governments and central banks to abide by these rules of the game? The temptations to violate them will still remain strong in a political environment dominated by ideologies of wealth redistribution, special interest favoritism, and numerous entitlement demands. A gold standard, nevertheless, can serve as a form of a monetary constitution, setting formal limits and imposing restraints on those who would want to abuse the monetary printing press. Similar to the way political constitutions, however imperfectly, are meant to limit the abuse of power-lusting monarchs and the plundering majorities in functioning democracies. If it fails, it should not be for want of trying. And a gold standard can be one of the positive instrumental reforms in the attempt to put the economy on a sound monetary and fiscal basis by instituting sound money. Thank you very much.
Dr. Barsky, it is your turn to present the constructive negative. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much for having me here. I'm very happy to be here, except that I did have to miss my course in rabbinical Judaism this evening in order to be here. I can take some comfort, though, in the fact that the arguments that Richard has just made have quite a religious character to them. I don't think this is a question of religion or ideology. It ought to be decided on the basis of empirical evidence and perhaps sound, practically oriented theory. In the course of tonight's debate, I will look at some empirical evidence and hopefully enunciate some basic economic principles as well. And I will demonstrate, first of all, that the gold standard has a terrible record in terms of price stability, which is supposed to be its primary virtue. Gold standards are inflationary. I will show that gold standards are associated with far greater short to medium run price variability than fiat standards, at least in countries such as the United States and Britain. And I will stress the fact that short run price instability is a real problem because it's highly detrimental to output stability. Now, I will focus especially on the Great Depression period. I will show that the gold standard transmitted the Depression across countries, and that the gold standard was a severe constraint on government's ability to fight the Depression by providing a critical monetary easing. We'll see that countries that were not on the gold standard in the first place didn't have a Great Depression. And we'll see that countries that left the gold standard earlier recovered earlier. The lineup is quite striking. Now, perhaps the most potent set of arguments of all against the gold standard, at least as far as the practical application to the present period is concerned, is that this is exactly the kind of situation that we're in now. The kind of situation that we're in now is exactly the kind of situation that does not call for a gold standard. Gold might very well be a good way to constrain a government that is liable to runaway money creation and inflation. For instance, the reform of the German hyperinflation comes to mind. That involved a reinstitution of aspects of a gold standard, and it was successful. This is not the situation that we are in. We have actually learned how to conduct excellent price-stabilizing monetary policy by the policy of flexible inflation targeting. It has been successful in country after country. In the US, the Greenspan and Bernanke periods have had perhaps the best price stability performance in history. Even Israel, which had serious inflation problems for years, has had excellent price as well as output behavior under Stan Fisher's flexible inflation targeting regime. Most critically, at the present, we are, if anything, facing a risk of deflation, not inflation. Gold is the last thing one needs in a period like this, as the evidence from the Great Depression will drive home. If Bernanke had been constrained by a gold standard, I would argue, we would very likely have had a severe deflation and depression instead of a, at most, mild disinflation, deflation situation and a serious recession, but one that was contained. Now, one might argue that loose monetary policy caused the housing bubble that preceded the recent severe recession. I'm saying this partly in anticipation of an argument that I expect Richard to make, but partly he's already talked about the Austrian idea that excess liquidity created by a central bank can cause a bubbly boom period that will inevitably be followed by a recession. Now, there's something to the notion that the Fed contributed to the housing bubble with excessively loose monetary policy. The Fed should have tightened in 2004, I believe, but capital flows from Asia were also a principal cause of low interest rates, if not the main cause, and the financial innovation that produced new and exotic securities was at least as critical to the formation of the bubble as were low interest rates. Proper regulation, including and maybe especially limits on leverage, could have prevented the bubble. If anything, the Fed should have been even looser and more proactive at the beginning of the Great Recession period. My last set of arguments will focus on the idea that a gold standard is only as good as the fiscal and monetary policy of the government. So Richard's notion was that somehow the government will stick to the gold standard, and that will constrain its fiscal and monetary policy. That'll keep the government from spending and printing money in order to finance the spending. Well, an alternative possibility is that the government will run the gold standard into the ground. A government that is committed or can't help itself from excessive money creation and excessive spending, in other words, the use of the so-called inflation tax, cannot maintain a gold standard. That standard will be subject to speculative attack and collapse. In a small way, that is what happened to the US at the end of the Bretton Woods period. On the other hand, a prudent government that conducts good fiscal and monetary policy doesn't need gold. The gold standard was never an automatic system of the sort that Richard seems to describe. The classical gold standard was highly managed by the Bank of England. The so-called gold multiplier, which is the ratio between the amount of gold money, physical gold money, and money in the broader sense, was a highly variable quantity, and one that was always subject to management and manipulation by the government, sometimes in a positive way and sometimes in a very negative way. The libertarian anti-government argument for the gold standard is weakened by the realization that good government policy was always critical to the smooth functioning of gold standard. How much more time do I have for the concrete evidence? Excellent, because there is plenty of concrete evidence. Could I please have the first slide, which opens the discussion of the gold standard's performance with regard to price stability? It's not showing on my screen here as it was supposed to, but I think we can, well, can you make it show? No? Okay, I'll have to move. First of all, we can see this shows the world price level between 1821 and 1914, which is often thought of as the classical gold standard period. England returned to the gold standard in 1821. No. Yes, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Okay, so the first thing we see in this picture is that the overall trend of the price level during the gold standard period was highly deflationary. Not surprising, the gold stock has to come out of the ground. It doesn't keep up with growing real GDP. And because gold is an inexhaustible resource, the asymptotic path of the price level really would be just eventually a falling price level that there's nothing you could do about, short of relaxing the gold standard and raising the gold multiplier. Now, the second thing you see here is that the year-to-year volatility of the price level during this period is extremely high. These are enormous fluctuations. I'll show you also in the rate of growth, the inflation rate as well in a minute. There's a lot of year-to-year volatility, much more than there has been any time since the gold standard. In a famous paper, Benjamin Klein wrote about the issue of high short-run price instability in the gold standard. He felt that was compensated by increased long-run price stability because governments generally cannot expand the money stock without limit. They cannot engage in constant rapid money creation with a gold standard. There is some truth to that, although there are other ways, and we can talk about that in the rebuttal, other ways to constrain the long-run growth of the price level as well. But what you see here, again, is a highly deflationary trend, a tremendous amount of fluctuation in terms of the short run. And this is really these are highly variable prices. Highly variable prices produce highly variable output. So it's not surprising that we had a panic of 1873 and a panic of 1896 and whatever, because the gold standard is a system with a great deal of instability. If you want to ask how could this solid metal produce highly variable prices, well, the solid metal is subject to gold discoveries. It's subject to periods of gold shortage as output grows, and it's subject to the monetization or demonetization of non-monetary gold. In other words, people melting their gold jewelry and monetizing it. Anna Schwartz demonstrated that a great inflation occurred in ancient times when a Persian invasion led to the melting down of Babylonian idols. And this is only an extreme case of the general tendency for the metal to go between monetary and non-monetary uses, causing price instability and resultant instability in output. Next slide, please. Okay, so here we see just in the period 1800 to 1920, two very large bursts of growth in the gold stock. The first one that you see here is associated with the 1849 California gold rush, or the minor 49er. The second period is after the widespread use of the cyanide process to separate gold from sand, which allowed the vast deposits in South Africa to be exploited. So these are the two, in this sample, two big periods of growth in the world gold stock. There are many other sources of growth and reduction in national gold stocks because gold flows across countries, often quite dramatically. It's hot money. Next slide, please. So here we see gold and inflation before and after cyanide. You can see that the gold stock starts to grow relative to GNP after 1896. There is a corresponding increase in the mean rate of inflation. But you also see that inflation is highly variable before and after. Again, there are lots of sources of price variation which are not due to gold production. Some of it may actually be due to the behavior of government in stretching and relaxing the gold multiplier, and a lot of it has to do with flows between countries and flows between monetary and non-monetary use of gold. Next slide, please. Okay, here we see real national product in the Great Depression, and it shows a number of countries: the US, Britain, Germany, France, Italy, Canada, and Japan. Well, the blue line shows Japan's national product from 29 to 38. And what do we see? Well, Japan didn't have a Great Depression. Japan was not on the gold standard. Nor was China, which also did not have a Great Depression, although it's not shown here. The US and Britain were on the gold standard. They are the gray line and the black line, and they had the deepest depression. And on the other hand, you can see a turnaround. It comes in 1933. That is after Roosevelt suspended the gold standard in the United States. Devalued and suspended in other ways involving the ability to use gold coin, which we can again revisit later. Germany was on a gold standard but left early, and you see that although it had a severe downturn, it turned up more rapidly than did the United States or Canada. Now, a very interesting case here is the case of France. France did not have as severe a downturn as did the United States, Canada, or Germany, but we also see that France, relative to its own decline, basically failed to recover during this whole period. France was the leader of the gold bloc. It shows up more dramatically even in the next slide. Can I see the next slide, please? Okay, so here we see from a famous paper by Eichengreen and Sachs, we see on the horizontal axis, the exchange rate, and industrial production on the industrial production as of 1935 on the vertical axis. Now, notice that the countries at the top left, Finland, Denmark, and Sweden, left the gold standard very early, and they have high industrial production relative to their 1929 benchmark. Look at who's in the worst shape there. It's France. France didn't depreciate at all against gold, and France has the lowest industrial production relative to its own.
Your time is expired, so I'd ask you to finish.
Okay, so again, I've shown that the price level under a gold standard was deflationary in trend and unstable from period to from month to month, year to year, et cetera, et cetera. I showed that the Great Depression seemed to have a lot to do with the gold standard. Countries not on the gold standard didn't have a depression. Countries that left the gold standard earlier recovered earlier. And I argued that while a gold standard may be valuable to prevent runaway money creation, the situation we are in now is quite the opposite. We do not want to be in a situation where the central bank is not able to create liquidity, and central bank performance has been quite excellent in recent years.
Thank you. Dr. Ebeling, you have 10 minutes. Dr. Ebeling, you'll have 10 minutes to rebut Dr. Barsky.
Okay, let me sort of deal with a few of these in more or less of the order that Dr. Barsky discussed them. Let's first talk about gold production and deflation in the 19th century. It is true that there were gold discoveries in the 1840s in California, in Australia, and this brought about a certain fluctuation in the relative rates of gold monetary growth during these short periods of time. But the implication over the century, or a good part of the 19th century, that Dr. Barsky tried to create it, is that because the world was on, the leading economies were on gold standards, and prices were falling during this time, this obviously shows a negative effect. One of the biggest mistakes that I think is often presented in a confusing manner in the general media, and to be quite frank, among some in the economics profession, is to assume that falling prices is itself a sign of depression or economic bad times. Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz, in their famous Monetary History of the United States, show that between 1865 and 1900, the prices in the United States fell on average and in general by about 50%. That was also the period of America's Industrial Revolution. Before 1865, we basically were an agricultural and light industry economy. That's when we became an industrial power. And as Milton Friedman pointed out in one of his essays, that period shows that, in fact, falling prices and economic prosperity go hand in hand. And it was logical. For most of that time, output was increasing dramatically. Technological innovations were occurring year after year. And the result was more and more goods and services were coming on the market, and given the money supply, each unit of money was able to buy more. And therefore, people were experiencing radical improvements in their standards of living by the real value of their money increasing through declining in prices, representing positive supply-side increases at lower costs at which these growing number of goods and services could be purchased. The other element that Dr. Barsky emphasized was this period of the Great Depression. I think we need to understand that the Great Depression was itself, at least especially in the United States, the result of monetary mismanagement by the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve, under the influence of a famous economist named Irving Fisher, professor of economics at Yale, decided to carry out a policy of price level stabilization. And if one looks at the general wholesale and consumer price indices from, let's say, 1922 to 1928, the general price levels are fairly stable. And the impression was, therefore, the Federal Reserve had learned the matter of how to monetarily manage the economy to assure a growing economy with price level stability. But in fact, what was going on beneath the surface was a relative inflation. If the Federal Reserve had not increased the money supply, because of output increases, cost efficiencies, greater supplies of goods and services, prices would have been gently falling. Positive supply-side effects. The Federal Reserve was increasing the money supply, artificially keeping prices above where they would have been through interest rate manipulation and monetary and credit expansion, and therefore beneath the surface of price level stability, we're creating distortions, imbalances, and mismatches of resource allocation and patterns of savings and investment that finally cracked in 1929. So the recession and then the depression that occurred was in fact the result of the Fed's own mismanagement of the money supply. Why was the depression as prolonged as it was? Well, to a great extent it was because of the misguided non-monetary policies of governments, both here and in Europe. Intervening in labor markets, in industrial and product markets, to prevent wages and prices from appropriately adapting and adjusting in the face of the bubbles of the 1920s bursting and a need for a readjustment, resorting out of prices, wages, resource allocations. It was the government's not allowing the market to work that resulted in this depression, being as severe and as prolonged as it was. Now, Dr. Barsky also said, well, look at Japan. Look at Germany, for example. They came out of the Depression. That's because they didn't have market economies. Japan was a fascist economy following the Italian corporatist model. After 1933, Hitler imposed a planned economy based upon the fascist model of corporativism, where all prices and wages were controlled by the government. And Hitler went on a big spending spree of deficit budgets, early Keynesian policy to bring everybody into work, building autobahns and what began to be a rearmament of Germany. That was not a healthy recovery. It was a distorted and twisted recovery precisely because government-planned economies prevented markets from working. So there was the illusion of prosperity. Everybody looked at Nazi Germany. Why can't we be like Germany? It was not a normal market recovery. It was the distorted economies of government just using resources and employing people what it wanted for its own planning and war purposes. And the same applied to Japan. You could have looked at the Soviet Union. They had no Great Depression. Yeah, everybody's employed by the state doing what Stalin tells them to. Now, so the gold standard did not cause the Great Depression. It was monetary mismanagement. Yes, there was a monetary contraction, but I would argue that the severity of the monetary contraction, because of depositor panics, companies unable to pay back their loans to the banks, was precisely due to the fact that prices and wages were artificially kept rigid so that the unprofitabilities and the falling outputs and the rising unemployment snowballed because governments prevented the market from doing its job to allow supply and demand to adapt and adjust itself. Then finally, I at least have to mention the comment that the regimes of Alan Greenspan and Ben Bernanke as monetary central planners have been blissful and wonderful. And I'm saying that with precisely to be sarcastic, and I mean no offense. The fact is that under Alan Greenspan and then Ben Bernanke, we have had two severe recessions. There was the artificial bubble of the second half of the 1990s, the tech bubble, which was fed again by monetary expansion under that same type of 1920s illusion of stable prices. Prices should have been falling during that tech bubble, but they were artificially kept up by monetary expansion and interest rate manipulation. Then from 2003 to 2007, you just need to look at the data from the St. Louis Federal Reserve, their monetary trends publication that they issue each month, and you see that during that time, when adjusted for inflation, interest rates were artificially kept in real terms at either zero or negative rates. Interest rates were not telling savers what real returns are. Interest rates weren't telling investors what the real cost of borrowing or the real availability of savings to support capital projects were. They were artificially kept low, and the money was just poured out, maintaining investment bubbles, housing bubbles, consumer debt bubbles. That is the result of monetary mismanagement, by not allowing interest rates to tell the truth. If there was an increasing demand for one reason or another by investors who want to borrow, given people's savings preferences, interest rates would have nudged up. And that would have cut off excess borrowing and investments that could have hypothetically been unsustainable. Interest rates were prevented from doing their job, which is to tell the truth. What is the supply and demand of the market? Under a gold standard, that could never have occurred. Dr. Barsky was concerned about, well, a recession. And if they hadn't increased the money supply, the Fed has created practically $2 trillion worth of additional reserves. There wouldn't have been a recession if the Fed hadn't mismanaged the monetary system and manipulated interest rates to create the bubble that resulted inevitably in the recession. And that is why we have to take the control of money out of the hands of the government and harness them and restrain them with an external anchor, which is gold. Thank you very much.
Dr. Barsky, you have 10 minutes to rebut Dr. Ebeling.
Well, Richard made some impressive arguments. I'll try to address at least some of them. It's hard to know exactly where to start. There are a lot of issues here. Let me first talk about the interest rate issue, the issue of excessively low interest rates due to excess liquidity that creates boom conditions that can burst and produce depressions, recessions, depressions. That kind of instability of liquidity can be produced by any monetary system in which money is variable, and there's no presumption that money is more variable under a fiat regime managed by a good central bank than under, or even an average central bank, than under a gold standard. There is a tremendous amount of variability in the money stock during the gold standard. This is something, the notion, there's a famous book called The Golden Constant. It is a fallacy that that gold money is not subject to highly variable supplies. In fact, the original theory of excess liquidity, depression of interest rates, et cetera, that Richard referred to, was developed to explain what happens in the wake of gold discoveries and how you get low interest rates and booms from gold discovery. So there's nothing that particularly commends a gold standard in that situation. Now, the issue of the deflation of the late 19th century. This is a very interesting question. Economists have talked about good versus bad deflations. And the notion is that a good deflation is one led by an expansion of aggregate supply of the sort that Richard talked about. It was a period of rapid industrialization and technical progress, and it does tend to depress the price level, especially in a situation where money is not growing rapidly. So in a situation that is aggregate supply driven, it is at least plausible that deflation is not a bad thing. Nor is it likely to be an especially good thing. It's likely to have to not be much of an issue when it is driven by smooth, rapid increase in aggregate supply. But when a deflation is led by aggregate demand and a collapse of aggregate demand, this is a very bad thing. The deflationary spiral causes very high real rates of interest, and these very high real rates of interest cause a dramatic collapse of investment and the purchases of durable goods, leading to severe depressionary situations. And those are very difficult to get out of. The only way to get out of them is to have a substantial monetary expansion, and that substantial monetary expansion is not, it could happen in a gold standard if they happen to discover gold in the right day, but it is not liable to happen. So a gold standard can be a severe constraint just when you do need to create liquidity to lower real interest rates and to get businesses and investment restarted. Now, the other point there is that the good performance, the good general performance in the late 19th century, the long-run performance might have been even better without gold. Certainly we were subject to panics. I mentioned the panic of 1873 and 1896. These panics might not have occurred if it hadn't been for the gold standard, and performance might have even been better. But I agree that, that real performance in that period was not bad, even though the price level was rather unstable. Now, do I believe that the severity of the Depression was indeed caused by bad central bank behavior? To a substantial extent, yes. The central bank did not take action, both in the United States and in Europe, did not take action to undo the essential instability of the private banking system. It is well known that what collapsed during the Great Depression was the money multiplier. It was the inside money created by private banks. It was not a problem of high-powered money, which is under the control of the government. So the Fed didn't perform well because it did not offset the decline in the money multiplier by printing more high-powered money. Sometimes printing money is a good thing. Sometimes we have to be free to print money. Now, there's a big debate as to whether the gold standard was the thing constraining the Fed during the early 30s. I believe that the gold standard was one of the issues, although the Fed actually had a fair amount of leeway to act because the U.S. had large gold stocks. For Europe, the gold standard was a constraint. Now, even for the United States, when Britain left the gold standard in 1931, the United States felt, and probably correctly felt, that it had to sharply increase the rate of interest in order to keep the United States from losing gold in a speculative attack and being forced off the gold standard. So we would have done much better to leave the gold standard and not jack up interest rates to a point where it changed a severe recession into a true Great Depression. Now, as far as the, so then there's the argument that the NIRA, the National Recovery Act, caused the Great Depression to continue and to it inhibited recovery. This argument is highly debatable. The preponderance of professional opinion is that the NIRA was not a very important factor either way. There is as good an argument that it was stimulatory by damping deflationary expectations. There's at least as good an argument that it had a stimulatory effect in getting rid of deflationary expectations as there is an argument that it inhibited private enterprise. I do believe that the NIRA, the kind of policies that Richard was talking about regarding prices and wages, did inhibit employment. So I believe that one of the reasons you had much better performance in output than employment in the 30s was the NIRA. Even there, though, it's very complicated because there was a conscious attempt to reduce the work week so that people didn't have to work as hard. And so the reduction in labor hours is in part due to that. 2003 to 2007, the housing bubble, I agree rates were on the low side, but, and the Fed might have tightened earlier. On the other hand, you have to recall that we were facing a threat of deflation coming from the recession, the 2001 recession, that began with the collapse of the internet bubble. And in fact, the Fed's policy seemed to be correct if the goal was to keep the price level stable. The puzzling question, the question that I'm actually working on, a number of economists are working on now, is what is the relationship between inflation of goods prices caused by excess liquidity as opposed to asset price, what you might call asset price inflation, or in other words, bubbles. It does seem to be true that the rate of interest that keeps you out of a bubble, the non-bubble rate of interest, may be different than the non-inflationary rate of interest. And this is something that Austrian theory can't explain because the non-bubble interest rate is also the natural rate. That's what I learned too. This is something we have to work on, and I don't know the full answer to that. This is a very interesting question, why there seem to be two natural rates of interest. When we blame the Fed for the recent, the bubble that preceded the collapse and the Great Recession, we do have to remember that the low rates were, to a substantial extent, caused by a global imbalance due to very high saving rates in Asia and a great interest on the part of the Chinese and others in government debt, United States government debt. So, there were a lot of people that wanted to buy U.S. bonds at high prices, or in other words, low interest rates, and that certainly had a lot to do with the bubble. Furthermore, regulation, including limits on leverage, could have prevented the bubble regardless of the somewhat low, but maybe not dramatically low interest rates if you consider the fact that prices, commodity prices were so stable. Let me see.
You're at your time.
Okay, one last point. Richard commented on the huge reserves or high-powered money that the Fed created recently. Professional economists believe that this is irrelevant. First of all, the interest rate is essentially zero, and second of all, the Fed pays interest on reserves anyway. Reserves have ceased to be money. Reserves are just another kind of lending to the government. It's essentially inconsequential whether banks hold reserves or hold government debt. So we can no longer think of this in terms of a runaway monetary expansion.
Thank you. Dr. Ebeling, you now have 5 minutes for your concluding remarks, and you may begin.
Okay, I think that the discussion that we've had here suggests to me that it is precisely the need for an anchor external to the powers and influences of governments and central banks, and an anchor such as the gold standard. The presumption is here, and Dr. Barsky was suggesting this when he said, well, maybe they kept interest rates too low into 2006, 2007. Well, how do you know what the rate of interest should be? The central planner cannot. The only way that we can know what the rates of interest should be, given people's willingness to save and other people's desire to demand as borrowers, is to allow the market to set the price. If interest rates are too low, given people's intensities and degrees of demand to borrow, whether it be the government or the private sector, the price will then start rising to reflect the greater demands relative to the scarcity of savings. There's no need to wonder, is it too low? Because the market tells you what the rate of interest should be. You don't need to rely upon central planners. Now, how do you free the monetary central planners of having this authority and needing to make these decisions? By putting the supply of money outside of their hands. The medium of exchange is supposed to represent an intermediary function between real savings and real borrowing, real spending and real production. And when the monetary authority has the ability to just print sums of money, then this sends out an immense amount of false information and wrong signaling about what is the amount of real purchasing power in terms of goods and services. What are the real patterns of demand? How do you know if the Fed increases the money supply, since a dollar looks like a dollar, well, this is a real demand because of a change in people's preferences or other factors in the marketplace, or whether this is a false signal of more dollars demanding this particular good and that particular good, and therefore misinforming people in their individual, or as the economist says, microeconomic market decision-making, and resulting in mismatches between supply and demand, resource allocations, capital investment across sectors of the economy and the types of investments undertaken. There is no way to get over these problems. There is no way for them to have the knowledge and ability to outthink and outsmart the market. It is why, as I suggested, quoting from Hayek's, the title of his Nobel lecture, this is a pretense of knowledge on the part of macroeconomists and monetary central planners through central banking who think that they can do better. Let me just sort of do one thing here, and that is to give the view of one of the most famous of the 19th century classical economists, John Stuart Mill, most famous for his essay on liberty, but he was also a great economist. He said this in the middle of the 19th century: "No doctrine in political economy rests on more obvious grounds than the mischief of a paper currency, not maintained at the same value with a metallic, either by convertibility or some other principle of limitation equivalent to it. Great as the evil would be if the supply of money depended on the accident of gold production, it is still greater, the danger is still greater, when placed at the arbitrary disposal of an individual or a body of individuals, who may have any kind or degree of interest to be served by an artificial fluctuation in fortunes. Such power in whomsoever vested is an intolerable evil." And to be honest, that is neither ideology or philosophy. As Dr. Barsky began his comments, it is the judgment of history in an informed and intelligent way. Markets know better than planners and managers in the government. And as public choice theory and the wise judgment of earlier economists pointed out, you cannot trust those who can have a hand of the crank of the monetary printing press not to abuse it at the expense of all of us in society. That's reasoned thinking, applying economics, and the wisdom of an informed interpretation. Thank you very much.
Dr. Barsky, you have 5 minutes for your concluding remarks, and then we will move directly to questions.
Well, Richard wants to put the money supply, take the money supply out of the hands of government, but instead he wants to put it in the hands of a random process involving gold miners and jewelers, and it's hard to see, to me, how this could be systematically better than government. Some governments are good governments, some governments are bad governments. Gold may be very good at preventing runaway money creation and inflation by highly profligate governments, and may have a role in the stabilization of a hyperinflation. But this is hardly the situation we're in at the present. In fact, we are at the so-called zero lower bound on interest rates. This means that basically the market cannot, in a monetary economy, the market cannot achieve the natural rate of interest. This is exactly the point. It's not true in a monetary economy that supply and demand for saving and investment will necessarily find the natural interest rate when you have issues of price stability and monetary instability. And again, monetary instability can come from governments, monetary instability can come from a gold standard. It is an inherent feature of a monetary economy, not something associated with a particular central bank or any central bank in general. Again, the issue is that the so-called money rate of interest and the real rate of interest differ in general unless prices are perfectly stable. Now, this can be associated with unanticipated inflations, which, as I demonstrated, are far greater during the gold standard period than in other periods. Unanticipated inflations and deflations, which cause the natural rate of the money rate of interest to differ from the natural rate, and that screws up the economic calculation of the marketplace that Richard is talking about. And finally, when you're in a deflationary environment, the lowest the nominal interest rate can go is 0. The natural real rate may need to be very low or negative, and the only way to get that with a 0 nominal interest rate is to have inflation. Sometimes we need inflation. Sometimes the government has to create some inflation in order to get the economy out of that kind of a slump. We are currently in a situation of that sort. A good central bank can do a better job of stabilizing both prices and output than can a gold standard.
Okay, we've had a few questions that have come in before and during the debate, and a couple that I came up with. And I want to start with one of mine, since I had the opportunity to sit here and listen to this. If you look at today's international monetary system, we have fiat currencies that are publicly traded, available to be traded on foreign exchange markets. And the theory to some degree has been that this creates a competitive money system, at least in terms of multinational corporations who need to do their business around the world. And that the system has developed enough in the past 40 years, that the markets can punish governments who mismanage their financial households. And I think for some degree that was true. We certainly saw it in the Asian currency crisis in the 1990s. And so I wonder to what degree does that still hold true? Is the market capable of constraining government profligacy when it comes to their deficit spending and or their monetary policy? And I'd like to have you start with that, Bob.
Again, I'd like to reiterate that government profligacy is not always the problem. Now, it is true that we're worried about the fiscal situation going forward, and you know, there's the possibility that fiscal deficits will be financed by monetary creation. I think that will be true for Greece and not true for the United States, but that may be speculation. I assume what you mean, the kind of competition you're talking about would be that, for instance, if the dollar becomes a currency with unstable prices and high inflation, people will switch to the euro or something of that's
They
the
have
sort.
the option to do that.
They have the option to do that, and that's an interesting idea. I hadn't thought much about that. The extent to which the U.S. government is deeply committed to having the dollar be the reserve currency rather than the euro, I don't know, but that, you know. So yeah, that could possibly be something. But again, I really want to stress the idea that that it's not true that in all times and all places the job is to constrain monetary expansion. There are periods of monetary expansion, there are periods of monetary contraction. Each of those occurred under gold standards and under fiat standards.
Richard?
Well, I think that it's the problem. Since the Second World War, the United States dollar has been the world currency reserve, the medium of exchange through which many major commodities such as oil is regularly traded and denominated. But the fact is that because of America's fiscal mismanagement, growing budget deficits that are growing by the trillions each year, and therefore accumulating a massive debt, people's concerns about America's ability to fund and finance this accumulating debt and the entitlement programs, the funding of which is coming down the road in increasing quantities of obligations each year in the coming decades, is resulting in a lot of people around the world, governments, private investors, as to whether they can have confidence and trust in the U.S. dollar the way they have in the past, even with mismanagements in the past, but seemingly more stable than other governments and other social situations around the world. But the very fact that people are saying that maybe they should invest or shift their portfolio holdings of other currencies into the euro or into some international monetary fund virtual currency of paper gold known as special drawing rights, which would just give the IMF the control of a paper currency, which is advocated by China, at least publicly, the Russians and a few other countries, just shows to a great extent, besides power politics among great powers, who would prefer the U.S. not to have their dollar as the global currency, is showing the growing lack of confidence in the monetary and fiscal mismanagement of this country. And if the dollar is moved out of, the U.S. government is not going to be able to finance a lot of its borrowing the way it has, through the fact that it has been able to gain a huge seigniorage, that is, the profit from issuing a currency that other countries take, hold, use, and you get to buy their goods and they hold your paper. That's going to disappear, and that's going to have dramatic effects on the cost and the ability of the U.S. government to borrow.
Thank you, Richard. There's been a question that has come through several times, and a couple different people have put it up here. I want to set it slightly different ways, but the question comes down to neither of you have really mentioned anything about globalization, and if we look at stable money in a global economy as opposed to thinking parochially about our national economies, is there a way to guarantee, or at least what is the best way? I know there's no guarantees in life. Let's say what might be the best way to establish a monetary system for the world that will limit government's abilities and central banks' abilities to do bad things. And Richard, I'll let you start with that.
Well, the 19th century showed that as well. The first major wave of globalization occurred in the second half of the 19th century. With the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the stabilization of economies after what had been 25 years of war in Europe before 1815, the freeing of economies through growing liberalized policies led by Britain, and first Britain returning to a gold standard and then other countries doing so as well, the degree of international trade, flows of investment, movements of peoples became dramatic in terms of previous records in human history. And all of this was facilitated by the fact that not through an international agreement or an international monetary fund, each national government on its own, guided by the classical liberal principles of that era, decided to stabilize and anchor their currencies in a market-based medium of exchange, which ended up being gold. And gold became the international money. Why? Because while each country still had its national currency, each currency was fixed at a certain rate of redemption, a ratio of how many notes of a currency equaled, let's say, an ounce of gold. And through that, the fact that you could trade your pounds for a certain amount of fixed redemption rate at the Bank of England, you could go over to France, trade in your gold for a fixed amount of francs. You could undertake your investments in different countries. You could have money to travel around the world with. You could undertake your purchases of goods and service in this way. And that's what facilitated the monetary confidence and security and soundness. And in spite of what seemed to be fluctuations in gold supplies, if you read the people who lived at that time, the monetary theorists who lived at that time, they considered this a golden era of monetary soundness, even with the degrees of fluctuations and the occasional uncertainty of gold discoveries. And that is what can do it, returning to a commodity-based standard that represents the international and global medium of exchange.
I think Richard is mischaracterizing the gold standard of the late 19th century. It was highly managed by the Bank of England. Few countries were on the gold standard for the whole period. Countries were on and off. They needed capital controls in order to stay on the gold standard in many cases. Now, of course, that got much worse after World War I with the reinstitution of the gold standard in the 20s. But the notion that this was an automatic thing in which the private market chose to use a certain metal and prices were determined by forces of supply and demand without any government intervention is simply not an accurate characterization. As I said before, the money multiplier, the ratio of total money to gold, was large and variable. And again, it was critical that the Bank of England manage the standards. Richard referred to the rules of the game, which is that you're not allowed to inflate when you lose gold. You're not allowed to sterilize gold outflows or deflate when you're getting gold inflows by sterilizing them. You're supposed to let the international flow stabilize price levels across countries. Countries didn't always follow the rules of the game, often didn't, and again, the Bank of England had to take up the slack. As far as designing an appropriate monetary system for the present, I think I'm over my head. It is true, one of the undercurrents here has been, although we've talked mostly about money, there is a fiscal framework that underlies the monetary set of issues. And this is, if there's a place where I'm more sympathetic to the kind of arguments Richard makes, it would be here, because it could be true that devotion to a gold standard would constrain fiscal policy. On the other hand, you can leave a gold standard. So how much of a constraint a gold standard really is, I think, is an open question and has a lot of political, economic issues attached to it.
I'll let you continue that thought with another question that has been posted a couple other times as well, and one that was on my mind as well. If we're really worried about the fiscal side of this as much as anything, that, as you've stated, central banks have been able, if they're well run, to maintain price stability and therefore help the economy operate more smoothly. If we're really just worried about the fiscal issue, to what degree then could we not get the same result by just imposing our legal will on our government through, let's say, a constitutional amendment that would prohibit the government from ever accumulating the level of debt that it has today? So I'll let you continue. Do you think that that would be a more appropriate way to handle this issue, or do you think the monetary policy has a place?
It's funny. I at first thought you were going to talk about some kind of a constitutional constraint on the central bank, which would be another thing. I mean, a central bank that refuses to monetize government debt is a very helpful constraint, and that's exactly what the conservative central banker model, starting with Volcker and then Greenspan and Bernanke, is about. So I do think that you need something to keep the monetary authority independent of the fiscal authority and not subject to excessive manipulation or pressure from the fiscal authority. But again, it's not at all clear to me that gold is better than the notion of appointing conservative central bankers who see inflation as the lexicographically more, price instability and inflation as the biggest thing that a central bank is supposed to stabilize. Sorry, I've forgotten the other. I've forgotten the last part of the.
No, the question was, is
Oh,
that
the
a
fiscal,
superior
the
mechanism?
fiscal issues. Yeah. We're not in a desperate fiscal situation now, but I am not sure that any monetary constraints can deal with the fundamental problems of entitlements and an aging population, Social Security, Medicare, medical health insurance. These are serious issues that have to be dealt with, and I'm not at all sure that any kind of monetary constitution or constraint could handle these issues.
Let me sort of lead into this by saying that at one level, there are certain things that Dr. Barsky has emphasized before and reiterated again that I happen to agree with, but our interpretations perhaps would be a little different. He's absolutely right that in the 19th century, these were government-managed gold standards. And they did follow either rules of the game or they violated the rules of their own rules of the game same time. And there were degrees of instability. 3 times in the middle decades of the 19th century, the Bank of England had to suspend gold redemption because of monetary problems. And there were many other instances as the 19th century progressed in which there was monetary instability under a gold standard. But why? To my mind, it is precisely because you still had central banks with central banking managers responsible to follow these rules. Now, there were institutional reasons concerning the reserve rules that I think caused the instabilities in the British banking system, separate from the mismanagement sometimes by the central bank authorities. But the fact is, the problem is that these were still central banks in government hands that were generally tied by these rules of the game and within sort of a corridor, more or less followed them a good part of the time. But they too came under these political pressures from various factors within the society and their own governments, and they violated the rule. That is why, in my view, the advocacy of a gold standard for the government is a preface. And what is it the preface to? The abolition of central banking completely. To separate money from the state totally. To privatize banking. To have competitive free banking having nothing to do with the government. Make banking and financial intermediation the same as going to Kroger's or Macy's for a financial service, where you deposit your gold and silver and the bank to which you've deposited your money issues its own notes and is liable under law to make payment on demand, and therefore to properly manage its reserves to outstanding liabilities to see that through the clearing mechanism and demands of depositors, it does not get excessively beyond what can afford to do in terms of lending. That is the ultimate thing, to get government out of the money business completely, the privatization, the denationalization of money. The advocacy of a gold standard is merely, like I said at the end of my original comments, However imperfectly, constitutions can often act as ways to delay, limit, retard the abuses that a political authority otherwise would have if they didn't have controls. The same thing applies here. If you have people who don't believe in constitutional restraints, the Constitution is ignored. If people manage a government central bank, even with a gold standard, but ideologically, philosophically, for whatever special interest reasons, don't want to abide by the rules, it's violated. At the end of the day, it requires an attitude in the society that the purpose of government is to protect our liberty and not to use government to give ourselves favors at other expense, including through the monetary printing press. And until that happens, gold standards can delay, retard it when you sort of straitjacket what the monetary authority can do within certain strains. But until that philosophic change occurs in society, you'll always have these temptations taken advantage of. Because governments can go off the gold standard, which they did in wars.
Since Dr. Barsky is our guest here at Northwood University, I'm going to give him the opportunity to have a last comment. We are almost out of time, so I'll let you conclude your thoughts.
Make a grand closing statement, but instead I'd actually like to try and respond to a couple of things that Richard raised again, just because that's, more intellectually satisfying. The first, so it's very interesting that that this private money system that Richard is proposing requires a government regulation that they have to make payments in gold. Why do you need such a government regulation if the private economy can do everything by itself? And second of all, we did a lot of what Richard is spelling out there with the shadow banking system that we had that greatly expanded during the 2000s period. And this shadow banking system is widely understood to have created a disaster in all kinds of unregulated securities that nobody fully understood, and that the lack of any constraints on leverage, governments can screw up and private markets can screw up. And the presumption that governments screw up more than private markets seems to me to be unclear. It seems more likely to be true when you're talking about fiscal authorities and presidents and congresses and parliaments, and to my mind, less likely to be true under a highly professional central banker of the sort we've had in the Greenspan and Bernanke periods. And the last thing there, again, I just wanted to, I want to stress that governments, the way Richard has talked tonight and the way Richard has spoken tonight, there's always this bias towards government being too loose, the government monetary authority being too loose. The government monetary authority can also be too tight. You can err in both directions, and that's one of the things that I hope that people will take home. And that ties in, to my mind, with with my perhaps technocratic view that this is not so much an issue of ideology, where we have to be concerned with a government that is primarily devoted to abusing its power via the printing press, and rather to treat this as a rather technical issue involving how do we keep money stocks and interest rates under reasonable control.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, just a minute. I would like to formally thank Dr. Richard Ebeling, Dr. Robert Barsky for participating in this evening's debate. And again, it's been a wonderful night. I hope the audience has learned as much and come away with as much as I have. So thank you all very, very much.
Thank you very much. Your first rebuttal was
Nice job.
very well.